I'm going to admit to a couple of woodworking weaknesses. One is that I tend to hold on to pieces of wood that probably have outlived their purpose, and I should either just get rid of them into the burn barrel or pass them along to somebody else. The other is I'm kind of a sucker for coming up with shop-built accessories that can solve some problems. Even if there are some low-cost commercial versions available, I just like making stuff. And that's definitely the case when I came across the plan for this sanding block. Now you can find the plans for it free at woodsmithplans.com. What I want to show you is just how easy it is to make. In fact, you'll spend most of your time at the bandsaw with a little bit of a stopover at the drill press. Now what I like about this sanding block is that it's designed for either a quarter sheet of sheet sandpaper, or you can actually use adhesive back sandpaper as well. Now it's got a handle on it, so it's going to be pretty comfortable. We made this one out of some lightweight pine, so it's not going to be real heavy while you're doing sanding. And then the other thing that you can notice is that the sanding block tapers in towards the top, so you can sand right up against an adjacent surface or edge and not bust your knuckles along the way. The starting point for making it is to glue up some pieces. You're going to need 2 pieces for each block. Now, like I said, I hold on to some pretty interesting pieces of wood. So I had some chunks of 2x4 left over. So I glued up one piece for the top part of the sanding block, and then you'll need a 1/2 inch piece for the bottom of it. So what I actually did was glued up 2 sections of a 2x4 and then just resawed a 1/2 inch section off over at the bandsaw here. Then with these 2 pieces, that's going to allow you to cut out this middle section here where the handle's going to be. To do that, you can print off a pattern of the profile of the sanding block. Then I cut it out with some scissors, and then I'll just lay it in place with the 2 pieces of the blank held together, and then you can just trace the profile with a pencil. It's not any big deal. And then once you're done, our first step is to head over to the bandsaw where we'll cut out this middle section. Before we can continue on in making the sanding block, what I want to do is smooth out those blade marks that the bandsaw left when I cut out the inside of the handle. Now you probably noticed that I was using a blade that was probably a little bit too big for the job. So it left a little coarser blade marks than what I was looking for. So what I'm doing is using a coarse tooth rasp that's half round on one side, flat on the other, to blend in those blade marks and get rid of them. What I'm ultimately looking for is something like this, where I have a pretty smooth surface on the inside. And I cleaned up the rasp marks with a half round file. Now you can go as nutty as you want here and clean things up even further by using some sandpaper just to blend it in. It is a shop project, so I know it's going to get used, and it's soft Douglas fir, so it's going to wear down with some use anyway. So if you just kind of sand it and file it to however you want. From there, what we can do now is to glue the bottom piece onto the surface here. Now, any woodworking glue is going to work for this job, but I kind of want to keep this project moving along, so I'm going to use Titebond's Quick and Thick glue. Now, it has a pretty, like the name implies, thick consistency, but what I like about it is that after I apply this and then brush it out, because I want a nice even coat, is that after I put the bottom on here, clamp it in place, in just a few minutes, I can pull the clamps off and continue on with the rest of the process and not worry about the 2 pieces separating. All right, so while that one dries, I'm going to continue working on this other one. After taking care of the shaping on the inside of the sanding block, we turn our attention now to the profile on the outside. We're going to do this in 2 steps. While the blank is still square, I'm going to cut out the main outer profile. Now while I'm cutting out this outside shape, I'm also going to create a little notch near the nose of the sanding block, and that notch is going to house a clamp pad that'll be used to secure the sandpaper later on. So what I'll do is make 2 shallow cuts to define the edges of that notch, and then a number of other little short cuts in there that'll help me be able to flatten out that notch back at the workbench using a chisel. The next step in the shaping project is to cut the angled sides on our sanding block. There's a few ways you can do this. One is to tilt the saw table on your bandsaw. I usually try to avoid doing that just because it can sometimes be a little bit of a hassle bringing it back up to 90 degrees. So what I'm going to do instead is to take a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I've ripped to a 1/2 inch wide. And I have some pieces of double-sided tape on the back side. I can peel off. I'm just going to stick that to the bandsaw fence. Now I've positioned the rip fence on the bandsaw so that the edge of the sanding block is going to mean that I'm going to trim starting right at the very corner of the sanding block. You can see here how that shim is tilting my sanding block blank. Now I can make a pass on one side using a long push stick to finish up the cut, keep my hands away from the blade. Then I'll wrap it up by making a second cut, this time feeding from the back end of the sanding block to trim the other side. Before we go any farther with the process on making the sanding block, what I want to do now is take care of this notch near the front edge for that clamp pad. Now, making that series of saw cuts in there is a big help because I can come through with a chisel and start breaking out these short grain pieces. When I do that, that's going to leave a little bit of stubble down on the bottom. So what I can do at that point is come and make paring cuts across the grain to trim that all up. But it's also the opportunity to use another tool, and that's a router plane, where now I can set the blade for light cuts and come across the workpiece, trimming away that material. What I'm looking for as I go along is to get a nice smooth surface and a consistent depth all the way across. It's going to take a little bit of time, but in the end you'll see how easy it is to do. Now the bottom of this notch doesn't have to be glass smooth. In fact, most of the time you're never going to see it because it's going to be covered up by the clamp pad and the sandpaper. You do want it smooth enough so that you can be able to see your markings for this next step. What I want to do now is to mark a hole location for a threaded insert that gets installed in the bottom of that notch, and that will anchor a studded knob that holds the clamp pad in place. Now that hole isn't centered on the width of that notch. It's offset a little bit more towards the back to be able to give you enough meat back here to be able to sink that insert down in. So I'm going to mark the back edge location here, and then I'm going to set this and mark the center point of that notch as well. Now I can head over to the drill press and use a Forstner bit. I'm going to prop up the nose of the sanding block so that the drill bit is going to go in at a 90-degree angle to the bottom of this notch. Then I'll come back here and drive it in. Okay, what I needed to do now was install the threaded insert in the face of that notch. So I just clamped it into my vise so that it was flush with the workbench surface so that I could use my installation jig. The next step is to cut from some hardboard the clamp pad that's going to go over the top of it. Now I just did this at the bandsaw, ripping it to width and then setting that strip into place and then tracing it, and then I can cut the angles on either side. Now all I need to do is drill a hole in the middle of it, and I'm ready to do the final shaping on the sanding block, and then it'll be ready for action. Okay, with our clamp pad and the knob in place on the sanding block on the front, what we want to do now is flip it around and start working on the final shaping. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to blend these facets left over from the bandsaw work into a smooth curve along the back. Then I want to round it in both directions to create kind of a bun at the end, because what I'm looking for is something that's going to be comfortable to use. To start the process, I'm going to use a rasp again. So between the coarse teeth on the rasp and the relatively soft construction lumber that I'm using for the sanding block, this shaping doesn't take too much time. From there, once you have the curve on the top, we want to start rounding over those sides, again using the rasp. Now for this to work real well, what you want to do is be going with the direction of the grain. So as I'm working on this side, I'm taking a stroke along the side and then towards the back. For this side, I'll want to do the same thing, so I'll need to reposition it. That's kind of the challenge with the shape of the sanding block, is that you're going to have to reposition it on your bench and find some unique clamping solutions. Now, as you can see, the rasp does work pretty fast, but it leaves some pretty significant tooth marks on there, so you want to come back with a file to clean those up. Then you can finish up using some sandpaper, going as fine as you want it to be. Then you can reposition the sanding block to do the same kind of work along the front edge as it slopes down to the side. And then don't forget, when you're working, to get the underside of the handle here, because you want to get that just with some sandpaper, just to ease that enough so that when you hold on to it, it's going to be comfortable to grip. So what you're looking for at the end is something along these lines, where you have a nice even shape, it's smooth and comfortable to hold on to for those long sanding sessions. Now the next step is to cut a kerf across the back or the heel of the sanding block. And that kerf is going to hold the sandpaper on the back edge so that when you wrap it around the bottom of the sanding block and then secure it with the clamp pad, it'll be held in place. Now making that kerf is as simple as just drawing a line across the heel. Then I'm going to use a handsaw. I'm going to use a Japanese pull saw here to do it. Now cutting into the end grain can be a little tough to get started, so I'm going to start at a corner here. And then work my way across. Once the kerf is established, I can begin to cut it at an angle. And it doesn't have to be very deep. Then I want the sandpaper to slide in there easily, so I'm going to take some sandpaper that's just doubled up, and I'll slip it into the kerf. And just kind of saw it around a little bit just to widen it out and make the sandpaper slide in easily. For this final step in our project, I want to put some cork on the bottom of the sanding block. Now the cork cushions the sandpaper to help it last longer, and it's also a lot easier for you to be able to get a smooth, flat surface. Now to do that, you can use any kind of cork. What I had was some adhesive-backed cork shelf liner, so I'm just going to use that. I'll just peel off the backing here. And then line up the block. And I can just trim it with a utility knife. There we go. We have a handy tool now for getting your projects looking to be their best and ready for some finish. It's also a pretty nice way to be able to transform some scrap wood that you have laying around into a useful tool. Now don't forget, you can find free plans for this sanding block at woodsmithplans.com.
Woodsmithplans.com. Hundreds of professional, high-quality woodworking plans right at your fingertips. Every single plan is presented as an easy-to-download digital package that includes pages of step-by-step instructions, full-color photos, illustrations, and exploded views, retail sources for hardware and supplies, plus a cutting diagram and materials list. Many plans offer handy video overviews and guides. Plus, we're proud to offer our plans in both standard and metric. Everything is here, from gorgeous heirloom furniture projects to handy shop projects and upgrades, clever, cost-effective storage solutions, as well as weekend projects and accessories that are great for gifts. All fully searchable and categorized for easy browsing. Woodsmithplans.com, everything you need for building fine woodworking projects.